tonight.
Let me be a little bit autobiographical on how I got into this question of drama. I didn't, in the beginning, I actually didn't know why I was doing it. But I've attempted, through the course of many years, to write history. You know, I studied the history of the labor movement. I studied the history of, as Therese said, Rosicrucianism. And when you study history, and you're not just going to be an academic or make a living at it, but really try to understand what happened, what really happened, what made people do what they did in that moment of history. It always borders, always, on classical drama. In other words, you're always led to, and every period of history, by the way, does have something called a punctum saliens. In other words, when you write history, from a real standpoint as opposed to an academic standpoint, what are you attempting to do? You're trying to understand why people did what they did and why we are the way we are today. What are the historical decisions that people made that led us to where we are? That's the only interest in history, unless you're going to be some stupid professor who basically is making a living at it, and that's publish or perish. It doesn't really matter what you say, you know, as a professor. So, but the point is that it always verged on a moment of truth, a moment where a decision by an individual, and that's the only way to study history. This idea of sociological phenomena is just stupid. It's individuals at a key moment in history who can make a difference, either decide to make a difference, which is rarer in history, but it does happen, which is how our country came into being, right, which is one of the studies I made, or where, more likely, individuals try to just refuse to make a fundamental decision, and things devolve from that, right? So that it is always the case, and by the way, I will prove tonight, it has always been the case, that that tragedy comes from an individual attempting to conceive of why things are the way they are, as opposed to have just a sense certainty view that it is what it is, and it happened yesterday. Okay, so that to write real history always borders on the attempt to write classical drama. Always, all good histories must have certain principles of classical drama. Schiller, in writing the history of the Netherlands, has, if you read this, classical drama. One of the reasons that Schiller became a dramatist, and Shakespeare, and I'll prove tonight Aeschylus and others, is that they were first and foremost historians. They were first and foremost trying to figure out why things were the way they were and how you could change them, right? So, for instance, Schiller chose, it wasn't arbitrary, the plays that Schiller chose. Like, for instance, for France, the punctum saliens for France was what Joan of Arc did. There would be no nation of France but for what Joan of Arc did, okay, in terms of militarily saving the place, and that laid the basis for later Louis XI, who was trained by the Brethren of the Common Life, to create France. But he chose the punctum saliens for the creation of France. Also in England, what play did he write for England? Maria Stuart, or the battle between Queen Elizabeth and Mary Stuart. A moment of critical importance for what shaped England. So he was always, as a historian, he first did tremendous studies of the particular period that he was doing, and then tried to focus in on the key moment and provide the psychological insight on why things were the way they were. All right? So this idea that drama is something entertaining, in the sense that most people think of Hollywood drama, it is exactly not that. It has never been that. It is an attempt to get at certain fundamental truths about how a society and how a civilization is formed. Now, with that said, I want to do something that has probably never been done before. What we're first going to do is we're going to look at one of the most influential writers on the question of classical tragedy, a guy by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote a very famous essay, probably one of the most influential essays, on where it's called The Birth of Tragedy. This was a very early essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, who later was a precursor to fascism. And he was part of a project that was set up by a guy by the name of Richard Wagner in Germany. Wagner wrote these operas, these very strange operas. We used to have a joke. These ring cycles, they're playing the ring cycle. Now, each of the operas is 3 hours, right? But there's 3 of them, so it's a 9-hour opera. And the music is terrible. I guess a guy named Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, once said of Wagner, he's not as bad as he sounds. So the joke was that you know, we went out in front of the Chicago. Therese was with us. We picketed, because this was the precursor to fascism. We picketed the ring cycle, which was being played in Chicago. And I was on a bullhorn. I said, well, you might walk in, but you'll goose step out, right? That's what I was shouting at the top of my lungs. And some wit came up to me afterwards. I almost got killed there too, but anyway, some wit came up to me afterwards and said, you got it wrong. Get him on the way out. Then they'll really be angry at Wagner. Which was good advice, but we couldn't wait 9 hours. But anyway, so with that said, Nietzsche was part of this circle around Wagner. And in fact wrote The Birth of Tragedy as a defense of Wagner's lousy German opera, which, by the way, had a cult movement around Wagner, which later became the fascist movement of Germany. What was the core idea that Nietzsche develops on the question of tragedy, birth of tragedy? He first develops 2 categories of mind. The first, he says, is Dionysian, after the god of revelry, or Bacchic revelry. You know, Bacchus, Dionysus, which is the god of dance, he says, right? Which was, I mean, he was the god of dance in Greek mythology. And then there was Apollonian, which was what he said, the Doric architecture, very, very structured. You know, one was very structured, one was completely unstructured. You know, wild, orgiastic dancing was Dionysus, and Apollo was the one who created an architecture. But he said that fundamentally the drive for tragedy came from Dionysus, right? That the actual drive for tragedy is that tragedy was based upon a certain conception of reality. What was that conception? He develops it in Greek society from what's called the myth of Silenius. Silenius was supposed to be the philosopher who trained Dionysius. Okay. Now Silenius, King Midas, you know, you've heard the Midas touches kind. King Midas, the story goes, wanted to find out the secrets of the universe. And what he did was he set out to find Silenius and beat it out of him. Okay. So they got Silenius, and Silenius says, you don't want to know what the secrets of the universe are. Midas says, no, I do want to know. And Silenius cackles and he says, man, race of man, it were better you were never born. That's first best. But if you are born, it is better to die soon. Okay. Now this myth of Silenius, Nietzsche says, was the basis of classical tragedy, or Greek tragedy. That this idea that in truth there was nothing that was real. There was nothing fundamental to the universe. And therefore, if mankind truly faced reality, he would say to himself, there is nothing, but I'm here. It's a precursor, it's existentialism. There is nothing, I'm here, and therefore my existence itself is an absurdity with respect to the universe. All right, which is the sun, and what Nietzsche says is that in facing that, quote, reality, that is where tragedy came from. That indeed, and in fact, there's a great defense of Hamlet in Nietzsche's work, in The Birth of Tragedy. He defends Hamlet. He said, Hamlet saw the reality. There was nothing to do. Right? No, it's true. I can, give you these pages of this thing. Right? So, and by the way, this is Hollywood. This is the essence of Hollywood. So what Nietzsche goes one step further, and Schopenhauer was his mentor, is that since there is nothing, then the only thing real is what the artist creates. That the artist creates reality. That in facing nothingness, the drive to create is what makes nothingness more than nothingness. Right? Okay, the triumph of the will. Right? Which is the essence, he says, of the tragic spirit. Right? So that he goes at that. He also goes further to say that what drives the tragic spirit, what creates the classical drama, is it comes out of what they call the Dionysian dance. That faced with the nothingness of reality, that people decided to just feel, because they knew their feelings. By the way, Descartes is a Dionysiac freak, right? Because he says what is real is our perceptions. The only thing we actually know are our feelings and our perceptions and our knowledge. We know nothing about reality, right? And therefore, dance, an orgiastic dance, in which you lose yourself completely. This is the same famous St. Vitus's dance of the Middle Ages and the other thing, was the driver force for the creation of the tragedy. Now, it's interesting, because he's not the reason it's interesting to look at Nietzsche. He's not the stupidest guy who ever walked the face of the earth. He's one of the most evil guys who ever walked the face, but not stupid. Because the fact of the matter is, when people descend to the level of beasts, this is what they think. Okay? So he says this, and he said that if you look at the history of Greek classical tragedy, what it starts with is indeed, it is true that the first classical tragedies were the choruses, were Bacchic choruses or Dionysian choruses. In other words, it started at the Olympic Games, and you have to realize it was 10,000 people, and it was in a circle, it was circular. It was 10,000 people. It started at the Olympic Games, and that the first tragedies had no actors, just choruses and dance. That's true. Okay, I mean, at least from the evidence that we have. Okay, and then, okay, so that was his view of tragedy, and in fact, it is the view of Aristotle when he talks about cathexis, right? That the essence of tragedy is cathartic. You face the fact that there is nothing knowable, which Aristotle agrees. Aristotle says there may be God, but there's no way you could know one way or the other, right? So therefore, what you do is, if you accept that you will never know, then the only thing you do is have a catharsis about the fact you could never know, and you have a tragic catharsis, right? And that the myths that were created were based upon this so-called reality. This is the classical view, whether you know it or not. This is the classical view of tragedy. This is the classical view of entertainment that Hollywood presents you every day and the TV presents you every day. That there is no reality. There is only entertainment. And entertainment is reality. It's a virtual reality. And that is the classical view, or the view that predominates the majority of people today. They think of entertainment as the only happy point in their life. Right? They think of entertainment that way. Now, what was the truth of how classical tragedy came into existence? Now that we have Nietzsche's view of it, and I'll expand on that a little later. How did it really happen? And in looking at this, we're actually looking at how how Western civilization was created. In looking at how it in fact occurred, is we will understand certain principles of Western civilization. And the first, most important principle is something called statecraft. And it was created by the classical tragedy. There was no statecraft before classical tragedy. None. There was no view of a state. There was no view of a nation. Tragedy creates the basis for Athens. And I will prove that tonight. That Athens was a conscious project of the great classical tragedians. They created Athens. It was physically existing before the tragedy. But the idea of Athens, which created Plato, comes out of a conscious project of Homer and Aeschylus and Sophocles to found a society based upon principles as opposed to clans and clan warfare. In other words, and by the way, Machiavelli understood this too. And we revisit this, by the way, in Shakespeare. Shakespeare creates anything good in England. And very consciously. And Shakespeare, by the way, which we'll prove the next time, creates America. Lincoln, his understanding of statecraft was derived from Shakespeare. And that our nation is Shakespeare's revenge against the English. It's very provable. It's rigorously provable. And that's what made our nation great. It comes from the great classical tragedians. Now, how did it happen? First, the basis for Greek culture are two poems. One, they're poems by Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad. Well, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, you had Solon of Athens, who comes a little later and gives the Greek law. But the basis for Greek law is these two classical poems, epic poems. By the way, I have a theory about epic poetry, which I'm not going to prove tonight because it would take more hours than a Wagner opera. But that in fact, the way to look at a civilization is study the epic poetry. Because in the epic poetry, it defines man's relationship to God, and man's relationship to nature, and man's relationship to man. And these classical poems, which were sung, they were not written. The Iliad and the Odyssey weren't written until several hundred years after Homer sung them and trained a bunch of what they call bards or bards, people who sung these poems. These poems lasted for days. They sung these poems, and they educated their young to the history of their nation based upon these poems. And man's relationship to God was taught by these poems. And man's relationship to each other and other nations was taught by these poems. That is how they educated Greek society, by poetry, by classical singing of poetry. Okay? And in fact, the second poem, the Odyssey, starts where the Iliad leaves off and says, we're going to sing tonight about the end of the War of Troy and the return of Odysseus back to his nation. Right? So it actually references the way it's supposed to be sung. Right? And it was memorized. All these poems were memorized. They were not written down until several hundred years later. Okay? So what we have is something that was written several hundred years later. But what was the Odyssey, the Iliad about? First of all, you've heard the story, Helen of Troy. Well, Helen was stolen from Menelaus. She was the bride of Menelaus, who was Menelaus and Agamemnon, which the two brothers who ran Greece, or Argos, right, which were the major clans of Greece. And she was seduced by the gods to go with Paris back to Troy. All right, that's the sort of the plot line. In the poem, Homer is making comments on the relationship of man to God. Not to the one God, but to the gods of Olympus, right? And any thinking human being, which Homer was, would say these gods are crazy. They use us with impunity. There was no reason for this war. We killed most of the Greek civilization by this war. About a woman, right? And what was it about? What caused us? In other words, the question that as you listen to the Iliad, which Homer asked, is what caused us to do this? What caused us to take all of our Greek tribes, land in Troy, kill most of our men, most of their men? What caused us to do this? And how does Homer do it? What a poet. What a brilliant poet. The first scene, how does it start? It's completely strophic. The first scene starts is a council of all the actors: Odysseus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, who's the key actor in the which starts the Iliad. How does it start? They're having a fight. Why? Because whenever you conquer a tribe, they take the women, right, and they're divided up. This is Greek society. It was not the highest level of culture. Right? All right, they were called concubines. So Agamemnon took a concubine, from a previous conquest while they were on Troy, and so did Achilles. Now they're having terrible luck in the war, and a priest comes to them from Delphi and says to them, "You shouldn't have stolen this particular lady of Agamemnon had. You shouldn't have stolen her. She was the priest's daughter. You got to give her back." And the priest came, and Agamemnon treated the priest badly, and that angered the gods, and things were going very badly. So it's a war council. So you learn that in the war council. They say, give the lady back. Give the lady back to her father. Take her home. We'll get better luck in the war. So Agamemnon says, I will give the lady back, but I will take Achilles' concubine in return. And this concubine was given to Achilles because he was the most brave in battle, most courageous, most brave, and the men voted him that spoil of war. They're about to kill each other over this conflict. What happened to Troy? They stole Helen. They're about to kill each other. All of Troy is there because of the same thing that's happening in small, in the first scene of when the Iliad opens. It's completely strophic. It's completely self-reflexive. And no one can get out of their rage. No, they're just following their axioms. And so it starts like that. It's really supercharged. I mean, it's quite a poem, actually. And then there's accidental deaths and murders and slaughters and, things like that. All right, now, Homer begins to make a very ironic comment, but you can't make it directly because they'll kill him. I mean, you cannot mock Olympus. That was a no-no. So what he did was, by posing the story as it unfolds, any thinking person listening to this would say, maybe they're not so perfect, these gods. Right? And I'll tell you why. He sets up the problem. He says, maybe they're not so perfect. And my scene is the most riotous scene, where he's totally ironic at this point, is that Zeus is supporting, ultimately, Zeus gives victory to the Greeks. in the 10th year of the war, ultimately. But he promises, because Achilles has been offended, he promises Theaetetes, who was Achilles' mother, who was half god, half human, or she had Achilles by, she's goddess, Achilles had a human father. Anyway, it's a little strange, but anyway, but anyway, so Theaetetes visits Zeus and says to him, my son has been offended. I want all the Greeks to be wiped out, and at the last moment they got to come to Achilles and he'll save them, right? So first thing he says to him, Theaetetes, what are you doing up here? I'm married, Hera's over there, she's going to be pissed off as hell. You know, obviously he slept with her, you know, and she says, get out of here. I know what you want, just get out. I'll do it, but get out of here, right? So that's his relationship with Theaetetes. At the key moment in battle, Hera was supporting the Trojans. Wants Zeus out of the battlefield so Hector can kill all the Greeks. Hector is the Trojan, the head of the Trojan army. So she puts on Venus's belt. She gets all, you know, she just puts Zeus on fire, ducks behind a cloud. Zeus can't hear or see anything. He's completely consumed. They fall asleep. At this moment, the Greeks are getting killed by the hundreds, right? Hector's killing all the Greeks. You know, now anyone looking at this thing, would say, this is so capricious, this is so crazy. But it happened. The irony was, and this is the critical element of what actually happened in Troy. Now, I'll tell you a little funny thing about the British on the question of Troy. The British are famous for messing up everything archaeological. To present their own views of history, they never really wanted to dig to find out whether this thing actually happened. So the British always said Homer was a blind poet, made the whole story up. Now, a guy named Heinrich Schliemann, who was the great German, the guy who really founded archaeology, and he was a good friend of Humboldt and others, studied Humboldt, said, no, Troy happened, and I'm going to find Troy. So he went to Turkey, what is now Turkey, figured out where this thing would be, dug, and he found Troy. This battle and what happened actually happened. What Homer was describing was actual battles, actual, you know, they said 3 times around the wall, because it's an interesting story. Schliemann was led to believe there was another city, and he said, and he figured out through the poem how big the wall was that Hector and Achilles ran around 3 times. He said, this is too small, this city, this is not Troy, and it wasn't. He actually dug in another place and found Troy, exactly the dimensions that were mentioned by Homer in the Iliad. Anyway, Schliemann shows, what ensued was a dark age. That the Greeks were killed, the Trojans were killed. Ultimately, they got into Troy, killed everybody in Troy, razed Troy to the ground, killed every male in Troy except one, Aeneas. And the myth goes Aeneas escaped and founded Rome, right? Which is the Aeneid, yeah. Right? So he was the one Trojan who escaped and founded Rome, and of course Athens was founded in a slightly different way. So the Iliad, what happened was, in fact, was a dark age ensued in all of Greek society, in all of Western civilization, after the fall of Troy and the return of the Greek troops. Many of them did not return, which is what the Odyssey is about. A dark age ensued, and you see this. He shows that the levels of civilization had lost beautiful pottery, had lost much of the ornate capabilities that they had, and even language had degenerated. And he shows that in the different scripts and other things of Greek language, that there was a depopulation after the war, there's a pestilence, and that Greek society got wiped out. So Homer was writing about something that everybody would have wondered what happened. right? What happened? We got destroyed about this, and it happened. So this was a real question for everybody in Greek society, okay? Secondly, what he does in the Odyssey, which is the second part of the poem, is he shows that Odysseus, through the use of reason and of cunning and knowledge, makes it home. With his patron goddess was Pallas Athene, the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of justice. That's who Pallas Athene was. So that what Homer is consciously doing is he is attacking very subtly but very poetically the caprice of the gods of Olympus. In the first poem, the Iliad, it's very tragic, by the way. It's a very beautiful poem, very tragic. And in the Odyssey, he's resurrecting or bringing to the fore another goddess, the goddess of reason and the goddess of justice, Pallas Athene, against Olympus. It's a very conscious project, okay? Now, about 500-600 years later, this was before classical tragedy, the first classical tragedy to be played in Greek society came 500 years after the Iliad and the Odyssey, all right? So it didn't occur right after that. And as I said, it initially occurred as Bacchic dancing, or Dionysian dancing. But then a genius by the name of Aeschylus appeared on the scene. Now, Aeschylus was the first real tragedian. Now, he wrote 77 plays. We only have about 10 of them. And we only have one full trilogy, all right? But what does Aeschylus do? And this is a critical thing. Aeschylus does two plays that we have that are very, very famous. One called Prometheus, is called Prometheus Bound, which is, and it's 3 plays. It's a trilogy. We don't have all 3. We have fragments of the other 2. And he picks up the Prometheus myth. Now, what is the story of Prometheus? Prometheus was the god who Zeus wanted to wipe out all of mankind. And Prometheus was the god who came to mankind, gave wisdom and fire to mankind, and saved the human race. For which Zeus chained him to a rock. And as you learn in the play, unless Prometheus, who had foreknowledge, Prometheus means foreknowledge, right? Unless Prometheus tells Zeus what is going to happen to Zeus, because he knows how Zeus is going to be destroyed. Zeus needs Prometheus to tell him how he's going to be destroyed. If he doesn't tell him, Zeus gets destroyed. So, in fact, even though Prometheus is chained, he has something that Zeus wants. That's what the play's about. And the chorus, who's sort of the everyman, says to Prometheus, look, give him what he wants, he'll stop torturing you. And he says, you don't understand Zeus. The only reason I'm alive now is because I have something he needs. And therefore, I will never give it to him, no matter what the torture, because I know he loses. And he knows he loses, right? So, but now look at the audience watching this play. Now remember, you have to understand, this is not your normal play, all right, that you go to the theater and sit off. What the Greek society believed was that these actors were imbued with magical powers. These were religious ceremonies. This is how they did their religion. And that they became the very gods that they were portraying. And the gods were speaking through them. And that the tragedians, or the poets, were the intermediaries between God and man. And they were bringing it to the stage, all right? Imagine a Greek audience watching this play. The question for the Greek audience is, who do I root for? Zeus, who was the most powerful god, who was supposed to be the omnipotent, the most powerful, used his power unjustly. Isn't that interesting? Here's the man who saved all of mankind on a rock, threatened that his liver would be eaten out by vultures by Zeus unless he divulged the secret. Who do you root for? Obviously, who you root for. Everybody was for Prometheus. Aeschylus tricked everybody. They're sitting there. The gods of Olympus are acting capricious, and Prometheus stands for truth and knowledge. And who do you actually catechize on? Prometheus. Brilliant. Only a poet could do that, because if he said that out loud, he would have been killed on the spot. Right? So you have 10,000 people watching this thing intently and learning something about Olympus. Right? So it's statecraft. Now, the next play that we have, Aeschylus, writes that these are the next tragedies. Is what is it about? It's the return of Agamemnon from Troy. It's called the Orestean Trilogy. And it's the only full work of Aeschylus that we have. All right? What is it about? Agamemnon returns from Troy. The first thing that happens is his wife kills him on the spot after he gets off the boat. Why? Why? Because in order to go to Troy, to have this war, Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, had to be human sacrifice. The gods of Olympus demanded human sacrifice of his daughter to get the ships to launch to Troy. He commits the murder of his own daughter to pursue this war. Clytemnestra obviously never, he broke the bounds of family, right? One of the most fundamental, most sacred laws of the universe, right? The unit of action of all society is the family unit, right? So he had to commit an unnatural act to start the war, right? To get the winds to change and this kind of thing. So when he comes home, Clytemnestra, who has a lover at that point, waits for him and kills him. Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, is ordered by Apollo, because in Greek society, a father's death cannot go unavenged, no matter who did it, right? So Orestes is told by Apollo, you must kill your mother. You must kill Clytemnestra, right? Which was the second play. It was called the Chiophore, or the libation bearers, right? So the second play is Orestes is torn of what to do, but Apollo is telling him, you must act or else the law is not fulfilled. So the end of the second act, along with his sister, who entraps Clytemnestra, and the way she kills him is in a net. She drapes the net over Agamemnon to kill him. He uses the same net, drapes it over Clytemnestra and her lover, and Orestes kills his mother and her lover. That's the second play. The third play is called the Eumenides, or the Furies, or the Furies. At this point, Orestes is pursued by the Furies, his own bad conscience, and the Furies represent the unbelievable, unspeakable cruelty of the whole thing. And he's pursued. And Apollo says he will defend him. But he cannot. The Furies are more ancient than Apollo, right? So he cannot. He can keep him in the place, but he cannot defend him. So they flee to Athens. So the third play is set, after they flee, is set in Athens, in which Apollo and the Furies are contending, because the Furies need the death of Orestes to complete, to have justice. But Orestes was told by Apollo he had to do it. And he sues to Apollo. So at this point, they have the judges of, the 10 judges of what was called the Areopagus. The 10 judges of Athens are supposed to rule on who well, the Furies said, if you do not give to the Athenian population, they said, if you do not give us Orestes, we will destroy Athens. We will destroy your crops, we will destroy your children, and we'll ultimately wipe you out with a plague, right? So the judges had to judge, would they give Orestes back to be killed by the Furies, or would they themselves take the protection of Orestes and the destruction of themselves? And the judges of Athens had to make such a decision. Needless to say, the vote was 5-5. It was a tie. Right? And Apollo is supposed to cast the deciding vote. Apollo was. Apollo said, I'm not casting the deciding vote. The Furies will get me if I cast the deciding vote. So it's a complete stalemate. And then who should emerge with the answer is Pallas Athene. Pallas Athene comes onto the stage at that point, the goddess of justice and wisdom, precisely as Homer had resurrected her in the Odyssey, right? And she resolves it, much like Portia, by the way, in the Merchant of Venice. There's a reason for that. What does she say? She says, look, Orestes was told by Apollo to do this. And there is a certain lawfulness about, you know, this kind of thing. But what he said, then she turns to the audience, which is all the citizens of Athens. They're sitting there, right? It was mandatory. You had to come. It was a religious ceremony. They turn to the audience of Athens and says to them at that point, remember the Furies. You will resurrect a statue to the Furies to remind yourself every day of what happens when you unleash the destruction of families. When you unleash what you did at Troy, what you did to Agamemnon, what you did to Clytemnestra. You remember the Furies. Right? If you remember the Furies and resurrect a statue to them, well, you don't forget what happens when you transgress natural law, then Orestes can live, but you remember. That was the last play, the Eumenides, right? This is one of the critical tenets of all society, that there is a natural law, which if you transgress, rips society apart. And that hatred, remember, Greek society initially was a bunch of warring tribes, like any clan in Scotland, like any clan anywhere in the world. These were clan structures, warring structures. It was Homer first getting these Greek tribes to begin to consider the caprice of Olympus and the justice and wisdom of Athena. And then it was Aeschylus who begins to write a continuation of Homer's tragedy, really, which is what the Iliad and the Odyssey is about. Well, the Odyssey is less a tragedy, but the Iliad is a tragedy, right? It's Aeschylus who picks this up and puts it right to the Greek society. You continue this, you descend into another dark age, exactly as we had in the Iliad. And everyone knew that to be the case. And what he does is penetrate what happened that created this crazy Trojan adventure for all of Greek civilization, all of Greek society. So they become elevated by the watching of the tragedy. And the question posed to them, not answered, but posed to them at the end of Aeschylus's trilogy. And also the Prometheus thing, begins to open it up. The Greek court, what was called the Areopagus, came from this play. It didn't occur before. This play created the Greek court, created Greek law. And when Shelley says the poets are the unacknowledged legislators for mankind, this is what he means. It was the poets, in penetrating the critical insight of what happened to Greek society and how it was destroyed, that begins to elevate these Greek clans to something other than Greek clans. Athens was a conscious project. The next phase of this project was developed by a man by the name of Sophocles, who writes some absolutely, we have a trilogy of his, called Oedipus. This, by the way, Sigmund Freud got off on. Freud was another Nietzschean fraud, by the way. Now, what is Sophocles doing? First, I'll give you a little bit of the story of Oedipus, which also happened. See, the interesting thing about all these myths, they all happen. They're put in mythical form, but they all happen. The very famous story of Oedipus was that he unknowingly married his mother, killed his father and married his mother, completely unknowingly. Which Freud has, really has a great time with. Now, it's one of the most tragic stories of all of Greek society. Oedipus at birth was told that his father was told that his son would kill him. So what happened was that Oedipus, his father ordered a huntsman to take the kid and kill him. The huntsman could not kill the kid. So he bound his feet, set him in the woods to die. Somebody picked him up and brought him to another king, and he became a royal prince in another kingdom, right? Because the huntsman just couldn't kill the kid. Now, Oedipus later finds out from the Delphic oracles that he is slated to kill his father and marry his mother. Now, he thinks the people he's living with is actually his mother and father, which they are not. So in order so that he wouldn't do that, he runs away from his parents, and basically on the road, running away so he wouldn't hurt what he thought was his mother and father, right? Some guy tries to kill him on the road. Well, he defends himself, he's very effective, and he kills the guy. Doesn't know who he is. Then on the road he answers the riddle of the Sphinx, goes to Thebes, and because he answered the riddle of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is going to kill everybody in Thebes, and he saves them all, he becomes the king of Thebes. He has to marry this woman, right, whose husband is dead. They found him dead on the road. Right? What so happens, as you probably figured out, he happened to have killed his father, who tried to kill him, and then being made the king of Thebes, married his mother, right? But he didn't know any of it. Well, what happens is this. The reason I draw this out at length, because it's a very critical point about Athens and statecraft. What happens is that Oedipus there's a seer by the name of Tiresias. Now the play opens up, this is the myth that everybody knows. The play opens up, everybody in Thebes is struck by a pestilence. With the firstborn being dead, everybody's, they don't know what's happened. So Oedipus, who is the king, says, I have to find out what happens. Bring Tiresias to me, and I'll find out we'll cure it. Right? I'm the king. It's my responsibility. Tiresias, who knows what happened, says to him, "You don't want to know." And Oedipus says, "I have a city that's about to die. I don't care what the consequences are. I must know." And Tiresias says, "You will never know. I will never tell you." And he threatens to kill Tiresias. He said, "But why?" And this is just so sick about Freud, right? Why does Oedipus do it? Because he's got a nation or a country that's about to die. And no matter what the consequences, it was his responsibility to save this nation or city. It was a city-state. To save it. Therefore, his act of knowing, even though later you find out the actual story, and when he finds out, he actually goes mad and pokes out both his eyes. because he says, there's nothing I want to see anymore. There's nothing I ever want to think about. And he pokes out both his eyes. And he makes himself blind when he finds out. And his wife kills herself. It's quite an ending. But the reason he did it was because he had a moral responsibility to his country, which makes it doubly tragic. And that the audience doesn't hate him. They feel tremendous, overwhelming awe of his situation. Now, the second play, which is called Oedipus at Colonus, which is the second play of this trilogy, where is it set? It's unbelievable where it's set. You'd know, anybody who knew what was going on would know where this place was set. It's set in Athens, at the grove of the Erinyes, at the grove of the Furies. The second play starts where he's seeking asylum at the grove of the Furies. From the fact is, he's wandered for many, many years. He's completely destitute. His daughter, Antigone, goes with him and wanders with him. No one else, none of the sons protect him. He's blind, he has nothing. And he ends up in the last play at the grove of the Erinyes in Athens. Okay? What are they going to do? The guy is cursed, his flesh is polluted, he's cursed. And initially, the citizens who see him find out he's Oedipus. They, typical citizens, they go crazy. They say, "Oh, this is terrible. You got to leave." And he says, "Where am I?" They say, "You're in Athens. You're at the grove of the Erinyes." He says, "I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving." And a guy who has nothing, he has literally nothing. He's wandered for 10 years. He's almost all bone. He can't see. He stands with great stature again and says, "I have arrived at Athens. I'm not leaving." He says, get your king to me." Total command now. I mean, he becomes, he evinces a certain nobility and power at this point. And the king of Athens, I think his name is Theseus, comes to him. He says, I'm Oedipus. I have nothing. But will you take me? And the king of Athens says, yes. He knows nothing. He knows the whole story. And he says, yes, we will take you. We will defend you. Right? What an image. What an image of justice. What an image of truth. Right? What an image for all Athenians to be proud of. Right? And this, by the way, was Athens was going down at this point. And Sophocles is writing to give them a sense of who they were and what they represented. Right? Now Oedipus is now the Creon, who was the former, who's now the head of Thebes, is the brother. It's sort of a complicated name, but he's the head of Thebes now. Creon comes to the curse is, which Creon finds out about, is that if Oedipus does not die back in Thebes, Thebes will be defeated by the people who take Oedipus in. Oedipus did not tell the Greeks that. Did not tell, right? Said nothing. So because they took him on out of justice, a sense of justice. Yeah. Right? All right. So now the Thebans under Creon steal both Antigone, Electra from Oedipus. Now he's got nothing. His two daughters are stolen from him, and they want to steal. They want to steal Oedipus back. To stop. He cursed his two sons. Sort of a complicated story, but anyway. Now, what happens? The head of Athens says, "We will use the full power of our nation to defend this penniless beggar. He came here. He sued for peace, and I don't care who he is and what he did. I have given him justice, and the full weight of Athens will be behind him against a threatened war against a very powerful nation." Right? So how does it end? It's beautiful. Because they did that, Oedipus tells the secret to the head of Athens. And Oedipus does not die. He becomes a holy man. And at the end, he is somehow taken up, right, to heaven. But this is so different than many nations that Athens became a center of an idea of justice and truth based upon, ironically, the fact that Oedipus, who came to them penniless with nothing, gave them a great secret truth. So the metaphor for everyone in Athens was, we're special because we don't just react, we don't hate, we use our power for justice, right? So Athens becomes, through these tragedies, through these classical, several of these classical tragedies, the Athenian population becomes a great exemplars for justice. Okay, very consciously though, from Homer, Aeschylus, and Sophocles. All right, now what is the essence of statecraft? Where do we get our idea of statecraft from? And all the great plays always, in some sense, reflect this theme. Is that if you merely react on the basis of one tribe or one hatred or one axiom against another as percussive causality, right, as your axioms, then you will hate, revenge, all these things occur. But if you start from the standpoint of a higher one, a higher truth, something more universal, then man can transcend their circumstance of what you would naturally think, right, and become greater than their destiny, greater than what you would normally think. And that nations are based, the essence of nations and nation states are based upon this idea of statecraft, that a nation is not a collection of individuals, of individuals. A nation is an idea of justice, a unique idea of justice, because different people have different predicates of how they would do it. But that always an idea of justice, not an idea of revenge. The revenge motif, which was normal in society, which is normal in our society today, right, is what rips societies apart, what destroys nations, right? And that the purpose of classical art, and particularly in this sense classical tragedy, is nation building, is to convey a higher idea by using what people would normally do and force people to a conclusion that they wouldn't normally get, right? And that Athens is created, and I can prove it. Athens is an idea created on this idea of statecraft, this idea of a rejection of the destruction of what happened in Troy, the destruction at the hands of the Olympian gods, the resurrection of Pallas Athene, justice and truth, and that a nation was trained on these fundamental principles. That is what civilization is. Most people have no idea what we mean by civilization. It didn't occur naturally. In fact, naturally, what happens is you get these clans. So what Nietzsche does is he takes the initial sort of clan dancing, really, that's what it was initially, and he says that's what art is. That's what it means. When what he rejects is the fact that civilization is the creation of great men and women who have a great idea about the destiny of man. And that great idea about the destiny of man is what civilization is what classical art is. Our civilization was created by classical art. The epic poem creates civilization. It didn't occur as people decided to get together and love each other. Silly. That's just silly. It never happened that way.
It happened because of what Homer, by name, what Aeschylus, by name, what Sophocles, by name, had a great penetrating insight and a rejection of the heteronomy of normal life, and saying mankind is noble, has reason, and on the basis of that nobility and reason, we will create civilization. This is what Shelley meant when he said that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators for mankind. That's how it happened. You now have a great secret. That is how we got civilization. It came from the great classical poetry of the Vedic hymns in a different setting. In a different setting. But that's where it came from. And Nietzsche was an attempt, and a very conscious attempt, to destroy Schiller's view of this idea of classical poetry and classical art. The idea of the ennoblement of mankind, to give them something greater than their own destiny. That is what had happened. Now, who is Nietzsche? Because Nietzsche is extremely influential. Schopenhauer is extremely influential. Because they create a movement of pessimism that sweeps Europe in the wake of previous to World War I. And they created the basis for, Nietzsche was writing in the 20s, the 1870s, 1880s. There was this turn of the century, which, by the way, we're going to a millennium too, and all the wackos come out during the millennium. Yeah. It's like the full moon, right? Because all the millennium, we're going to return to, Aquarius or something, right? But Nietzsche's writing 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, around Wagner. Now, what do? They have a perverted, and a typical Nietzschean, they have a perverted insight into what I just told you. They understand the power of classical art. They understand that it is capable of creating either bad or good civilizations. If the power of this project to unleash this idea, they understood it. So what they did was they attempted to create, based upon Dionysian myth, they attempted to create, quote, a German theater. Now, what did they try to do? They tried to resurrect certain myths, Teutonic myths of Germany, to unleash a mystical power in the German population, right? A mystical power based on irrationality, not on reason, not on justice, but irrational feelings, right? And they created Wagner, what's the story of Wagner? It's sort of interesting, because you'll understand where non-classical culture comes from, at least in the modern time. Wagner was a very bad musician. It was laughable on a certain level. And he was a protege of Hector Berlioz. He went to France with his stuff, and everybody laughed at him and said, this is the most god-awful music I've ever heard. It's atonal, it doesn't have arias, it's just god-awful stuff. And he got laughed out of France. He got picked up in Germany by a mad King Ludwig, who thought that his theory of music was more interesting than his music, right? Because his theory was they wanted a pure German myths and pure German music. And what they did was King Ludwig, Wagner was bankrupt, and this mad King Ludwig built him a theater at a place called Bayreuth, Germany, which was basically a cult theater. And, it was big theatrical effects, lighting, it was big lights, a lot of loud music, and they would keep them there for 3 days with liquor, and by the time they came out of there, they didn't know if they were coming or going, and they said it was a great experience. Now, this cult
this cult of irrationality, by the way, is a precursor to these big rock concerts. Where it's 2 or 3 days of insanity, right? This movement was based upon certain ideas that the will, that is pure, that this music had no coherence with anything beautiful. Now, have you ever asked yourself the question of what makes something beautiful beautiful, right? There's, why do you say something's beautiful? Now, we're going to answer that next week. I'm not going to try to answer that tonight, right? But the point is that they rejected the idea of beauty. And what their music was the triumph of the will. That it was arbitrary, that it was chromatic, it jumped from key to key. There was no beautiful arias, a lot of loud arias. By the way, a lot of sopranos and tenors lost their voices during these things. But it's completely irrational and out of order. Now, out of this theory, the attempt to create an attack on this idea of an idea of beauty, an idea of truth and beauty, which we'll go through next week. This attack on truth and beauty became the bellwether of 20th century art. It came from this romantic movement, which is a rejection of the noble idea of man, and just the arbitrariness of effect. I mean, if you ever watch a Hollywood movie, it's arbitrary effects. It's a series of arbitrary effects, one after the other. I mean, they're boring, if not for the blood and guts and dissevered heads now and limbs and other things. It's boring. There's no character development. There's no plot. There's just a lot of blood, a lot of cars, a lot of speed, right? A lot of effects, right? It's unbelievable. But the actual theory of it, this theory of catharsis, is that there's no drive to get at truth and no drive to get at nobility, right? So that the point is that this idea of what we call entertainment is a creation of this romantic movement in the 20th and end of the 19th, early 20th century. The romantic movement which rejected truth, which rejected the lawful ordering of the universe. And therefore they created an art that was ugly and that was degenerate, right? Now, the fact of the matter is, by looking at this question of classical tragedy, which we will go through next week, the question of Hamlet, but I wanted to lay the basis of where Shakespeare came from, because he was a thoroughly trained Greek classical dramatist. And I'll show the Greek classical elements in this. But that the question of Hamlet as a tragedy, and the question of tragedy, is based upon the idea of the creation of civilization. He wanted to create a nation state through his art out of England. And that, ironically, as I said before, his drive to create a nation out of England came to the United States through various routes. Lincoln understood what he was doing, and at the moment of great danger for our nation, called upon Shakespeare to create America. So that's what we'll go through next week. Yeah.
I was reading in National Geographic. This guy is, you know, his famous, he made a bunch of castles.
Yeah.
And one of them is the model for Disneyland. You know, I had the good fortune of listening to your classes in Pittsburgh. And there's some different ideas you develop. And one thing that really struck me is the question of the family. And your reference to the family in a number of times, which I didn't fall asleep in your previous class. I was watching a video, but there's the...
They were only head-on shots. They were very boring.
Right. The thing that struck me in light of Elvis' presentation at the National Conference on the Pagan Religion.
Yes.
That in fact, to what extent, you know, we take it almost for granted. I mean, even in this increasingly dark age, that the family, you know, sort of an institution and so forth. But the Greeks were obviously fighting through this idea. There was, you know, human sacrifice, you know, revenge, killing, you know, in the name of your family, you know, killing your...
Well, even a family unit, you had about 5 or 6 wives.
Right, 5 or 6 wives, or in the case...
If you were victorious. If you weren't, you were a slave.
Right, right, and then the fact that, you know, the idea that his wife killed him after he killed the daughter, and she had 5 or 6 husbands maybe on the side too, you know, sort of
Rarely.
a little bit Mormon-like.
Yeah.
But I mean, would you care to comment on that? Because it definitely, in light of the pagans, you know, the Canaanites were heavily into this stuff too at the same time period. And in the modern, and then also in the so-called Hebrew culture, you had this multiple, you know, this big meat polygamy question. It's clearly an evolution, and
Yes.
it's clear that the Greeks are the first to address it.
Yes, you see, these clan structures are very strange things. They you know, I mean, it would be an interesting study. Remember, Marx wants to go back to the clan structure. You remember this community of women, communism, is to break down the idea of a family unit, which was a return to paganism, you know, the community of women, this kind of thing. It was all pagan religions. It really is with the advent of Christianity that you get the actual beginning of a discussion of an actual family unit. And because it is the natural reproductive unit, and more significantly, it's the unit of nurture to absorb a culture, right? To absorb the totality of a culture and the backup for the young child, and knows who he is, or she is, right? But, you know, this is critical, this fight. I mean, I'm not, you know, a big women's liberationist, but it really is true that with the concept of Mary, in terms of this idea of a woman who was completely intellectual, who took full responsibility for the human race, Mary was a rejection of this idea of women as really you know, chattel slaves, really, in these pagan cultures. So that there are some significant women, certainly Caesar's wife, others were fairly decent, but they're rare and few. Even in, so that I think there is something to it to be looked into. But it's clear that with Christianity you get a total evolution of the idea of the individual, each individual, man, woman, child, with an inviolable soul, very conscious, inviolable soul, that is given to them by God, and inalienable rights implicitly, even though society doesn't, you know, really, it's not organized to Louis XI to allow a perpetuation of that.
Is there a concept in you know, what you've read in the Greeks? Is there this concept of an inviolable soul other than Socrates and Plato in their dialogue?
Yeah, that's pretty good, Socrates and Plato.
Yeah, that's the start.
Well, look, I mean, look, what are you saying about Prometheus? I mean,
Yeah.
Prometheus is written by Aeschylus. What is Prometheus? What is the story of Prometheus? Man is not a beast. I mean, in other words, you have a very direct connection. And this comes through, if somebody wants to do some serious research, I can help you in it. It's good research to do. It's the question of, there was an Egyptian, I hesitate to call it a cult, but let's call it a cult for a moment, because it's not a cult. There's an Egyptian religion, let's call it a religion. It was called Amun, okay?
Yeah, the one God.
Yeah, they had a one God, and it was a reasonable God who created the universe. Now, the Egyptians founded Athens, that's a fact. If you read the Timaeus, the Egyptian is saying, you Greeks are real young. You have a memory of, you know, just yesterday. We Egyptians have memories of thousands of years. We founded Athens 3 times, right? And there was a group called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which Aeschylus was part of, which is part of this let's call it the cult of Ammon. It's not a cult, it's a religion. Moses was out of the cult of Ammon. But we know that. You know this famous Moses, the Jews have horns, you know that thing of Jews have horns? It's not really derogatory, even though it was used that way. The cult of Ammon's symbol was a ram's horn. So if you know the Michelangelo sculpture where Michelangelo has Moses with two horns, this is a symbol of Ammon, of reason. It's really not a put-down, although it got later into a put-down. After Woody Allen was so horny that but anyway, this Elysian Mysteries and the cult of Ammon were the basis for Solon. Solon had gone to Egypt to bring back the laws. So there's something very real to this, but I don't want to comment more. And that's the basis for which a lot of the actual elevated ideas of mankind, of an individual soul, and the relationship with God come from that. And that's the Hebrews. The Hebrews also. Moses, the Hebrews come from that also. Yeah.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about. Because you said that statecraft began with Greeks, and I was thinking about the Bayesian system of the Egyptians, their mystery, their mystery system. Like and also the Hebrew Codex, the numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and also Confucianism. They predated.
They did, but you see, what I'm talking about is, see, statecraft is very specific. Athens was one of the most remarkable societies ever produced. I mean, it was a real break with history. Okay, I mean, you had small groups of people who were quite brilliant, and in their own little small societies or cults or religions, as they practiced them, they were quite humane to each other. But Athens was an actual society. Right, and they created Plato, right, and created probably Eratosthenes, you know, the guy who measured the circumference of the planet. When you read, by the way, all of classical tragedy in the modern time comes from Plato. In fact, I would say all of poetry, if you look at Shelley, Keats, and others, are a reading of Plato, or commentary on Plato. Erasmus, a commentary on Plato. Cusa, a brilliant, brilliant commentary on Plato, right? So that I would say that what you're seeing in Athens is something of a very dramatic new nature, and much broader than a small group, right? An attempt at a society based upon reason. And out of that society based upon reason, you found Western civilization. That's what I'm saying. That's new. That has never been said before. All right? But I'm saying it now, and I think there's proof for that. I don't think you can just say it was a linear progression. That is not how civilizations work. At times you have, like Cusa created later, you know, a much more powerful idea of society. But I think between Aeschylus, Homer, Sophocles, you have something very unique here.
Well, I have a problem with Plato. In the same way that Toynbee was racist, Plato was sexist.
Oh, sure.
Very sexist.
Sure, but you know what? See, we can get into, well, Toynbee was a nutcase, by the way. I know Toynbee real well. If you take all, I imagine you're referring to the Republic of Plato.
Yes.
Yeah. This, by the way, is taught very badly in schools. The Republic of Plato is a treatise on statecraft. Not everything he says is right. But the fundamental principle, remember the famous initial phase of the dialogue, where, what was that, the guy says might makes right, what was his name? Lysimachus, right, says to Plato, I have the power to destroy you, Plato, or Socrates really, I have the power to destroy you, and what I say is true. And of course, Socrates proves to him that indeed he did have the power to destroy him, but it didn't make anything he said true. Right? and that you cannot base a society on that kind of arbitrary power. So that the initial fundamental question posed in the dialogue is that issue of how do you get at the truth? Whether the particular solutions to the truth are right, which I agree with you. A lot of the particular solutions are not right. The method of approach to get the solution, the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, which is the basis of society, is the way to go about it. So statecraft, which he learned at the knee of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in a different way, the method of statecraft is posed very brilliantly in the Republic, even though the particular solutions, are wrong. And that's what you got to look at. Is the guy driving for the truth? Right? Not whether he has all the right answers, but is his method of approach that way? If his method of approach that way, it's progress. Whether every single one of his particulars are wrong, you're learning how to approach the question of the truth. And I think that's what you have to take from Plato. All the particulars, like you say, may not be right.
Just one thing I want to say on the quote-unquote sexism of Plato. One of the finest treatment of women ever that I've ever seen in all of literature is in Plato's Symposium, and that is the treatment of Diotima, the philosopher, who teaches Socrates about the beatific vision and intellectual love of God. So I mean, I would challenge that. And I think that the problem people have with Plato or any other kind of literature is they read it literally. And that's a problem also. The literalism, the nominalism in this society is terrible. I mean, people have lost the sense of metaphor, and I'd like you to address that.
That's next week.
Oh,
okay. You want a 2-minute answer on that?
Yeah, right. Tony?
Yeah, can you explain exactly this whole concept of strophic poetry?
Yeah, sure. That I can do without. Metaphor's a little harder.
Take real good notes.
Okay, let us take a different kind of look at this, because I was thinking about this from the standpoint of music, and I'll blow your mind on music. Music is strophic. It's totally strophic. Now, what do you mean by that? You set up a theme, right? Now, let us take Hamlet, because no, actually, let's not. I'll do that next week. Let's take something else. Well, let's take the Iliad. It's a good example. All right. What is the metaphor of the Iliad? What happens?
About the Trojan War.
It's about the Trojan War, but what's the metaphor? Right?
Yeah.
The metaphor is, in a certain sense, Paris steals Helen, right? People knew that story. So that's, the audience already knows that walking into the poem, all right? First scene, what I described, this war of Agamemnon and Achilles over a woman, right? It's strophic. It recalls, it's a question of Plato's memory, right? Is that you're setting up a theme. This is the way the mind works, by the way. You don't remember facts. You remember singularities, right? So it sets up a theme that you don't even know about, has not even been stated, right? Helen of Troy. And, God, people waxed eloquent about Helen of Troy. Everybody's talking. And you know that walking in. You're not aware, by the way, until you think about it, of what this first scene is about. It's sort of like, all these Americans said, gee, how did it happen in Nazi Germany? All right? While they sit around watching Newt Gingrich run around. Right? That's a metaphor. Everybody says, it's not my responsibility. That's how it happened. It's a metaphor. It's strophic. It has a strophic quality. In music, it's the same thing. You set up something, a theme, 2, 3 notes, 4 notes.
You're not aware that this theme is going to be reintroduced again and again and again with different approaches. And the theme becomes modified each time that it's been reintroduced. The mind works that way. The mind does not work from the standpoint of individual notes or individual words or even individual concepts. They work as whole thematic developments. That's why you remember things. You know why everybody is so bad in school? Because the material is organized in an impossible way. You can't memorize it. You can't remember it because it makes no sense. It's not strophically organized. The mind is organized strophically. That's why you can see LaRouche stand up there for 4 hours, or 10 hours if you like, and go. He remembers everything he's ever read. Everything. And not because he has a photographic memory. But he has an idea of what is called, what he calls a musical memory. He memorizes from the standpoint of how does this relate to the whole, or how does this relate to the absolute, and he remembers everything in that way. So it's strophic, and that's what we mean by strophic. And I think it's very nice to know that an audience walks in, they hit from the first second with something they know is the whole theme of the thing, but they don't know what's happened to them. And then they're forced to reflect upon it. How much better is Achilles and Agamemnon than Paris? And then you have to go to a higher truth, which is located in the audience, not in the play. And that's how you create an Aeschylus and a Shakespeare.
What does the word stroke or stroke?
It's a structure. It's a structure. That's what it means. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Recording comes from strophic?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a method of composition. It's strophic. That's what it means. It's thoroughgoing composition. It's what it means. Look, let me say it the other way. Steve and I were discussing this. Maybe we can get him to give a class on it. It was just a brilliant discussion. Steve can actually prove to you that you remember the future. And it's absolutely rigorously provable. You remember the future. In other words, there's certain lawfulness to the universe. And that which coheres with the lawfulness of the universe, your mind rediscovers that lawfulness. That's why you remember it. What you're discovering is lawfulness. You're not discovering facts. And therefore, everything that is true has a strophic quality to it, or a metaphorical quality to it. Yes.
I have a question on part of the reason I think that great drama helped build civilizations, and in this case helped build Athens, is because the Greek language was developed by Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and even Euripides. And without them, I think that Plato and Socrates would not have been possible, because they could not have thought certain thoughts without the development through poetry in the drama. Now, a question I have of you. I have a real problem with prose in drama.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
And I think that modern drama is all prose, and it's even bad prose at that. And whereas really great tragedies and great drama, up to Schiller, it was all in poetry.
Absolutely.
There was no distinction between drama and poetry in that sense.
Yeah.
And see, what I think has happened, and I'd like you to comment on, is the flattening of the ideas and the concepts and the language. And I would almost, I don't want to outlaw prose drama, but I think it's bad.
Oh, sure, I would outlaw it myself. No.
What is prose drama?
Oh, the Death of a Salesman is prose. Arthur Miller. I mean,
Almost all drama written in the 20th century.
all drama written. I mean,
and in the late 19th century.
yeah. Look, I think we're getting at something of what happened to language and the ability to read poetry. And this is why Lynn screams about this punctuating, this question of punctuation all the time. The written language, this idea of written language is a construction that occurs later. The language was sung. In fact, Greek, except for certain, they don't have any punctuation. None. What you hear is the singing. What punctuates it is the singing, and they knew how to sing it, so therefore they knew how it would go. But they don't have a sentence structure, for instance. They just don't. They have a tense structure, but they don't have a sentence structure. So it was sung. Now, the problem in, and I'm trying to figure out where this, I mean, the real degeneration began. I mean, I think, you had certain rearguard efforts with Shelley and Keats in the English language. But after Shakespeare, nobody really achieved such depth. I mean, although Shelley and Keats made a good run for it. Now, what you had was an attenuation of the Italian Renaissance. Because remember, it's not just I don't want to shock anybody, it wasn't just the Brethren of the Common Life that created the Italian Renaissance. I mean, Dante created the Italian Renaissance. I believe the Italian Renaissance came from epic poetry. Dante wrote an epic poem called the Divina Commedia, right? I think that's what, I mean, it's not just the Brethren of the Common Life, I'm sorry. They played a critical role with Cusa, but it was also the Divine Comedy. Now what you have is an attenuation of the Italian Renaissance after basically, because Venice was not crushed, a lot of humanists got killed. Like Thomas More got killed in England. He was caught in a crossfire on this marriage of Henry VIII, right? Thomas More got killed. Others, the 30 Years' War just wiped out, which is all manipulated by the Venetians. Wiped out half of European civilization. Right? So you had sort of a dark age that the Venetians set in motion, and therefore you'll see a very dramatic attenuation of artistic production and these great elevated ideas with the onset of the 30 Years' War and the things that occurred after that. So I think that's what we're looking at, but you're absolutely right. There is no such thing as a prose drama. The whole idea of prose, except for an essay here and there, is absurd. In other words, what you hear in great language, what you love about Shakespeare, is its musicality. That what happens is that, I don't know if you've ever, or even with Verdi and others, when you really start speaking, I hope I did some of it tonight, you find your voice, you're not conscious of it, your voice elevates, you become extremely musical in your language. It modulates a lot. It's very natural. That's the way the mind works. So prose, when you're in a great eloquent moment and you've got no words, Willie Loman says, I don't know, I forgot, I used to know the play, but anyway, this is the death of a salesman,
Where's the keys to the car?
Yeah, where's the keys to the car? Or I love you, kid, or something, I don't know.
Yep.
Everybody tears. So yeah, I think you're right on this prose question.
Yeah, I'm going to ask
Yeah.
a question about how does, what you said was interesting, the way you related the poetry and the Iliad and Odyssey, Greek and Athens. How does the Old Testament come into any kind of, it's
it's
poetry,
brilliant.
It's literature?
It's
How did that
beautiful.
contribute to the,
It was great.
I know, but how did that,
Well, look,
seems to me...
Western civilization is based upon the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's no, as I said in the answer to Ron, that was a great step forward, even beyond the Greeks.
Before the Greeks.
But they were before, but they also, the development occurred as one, if you see the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Well, then it sort of goes like parallel the two.
No,
Greek-
there's a development from the Old Testament to the New Testament in terms of an elevation of a very specific idea, which is referenced in the first book, Genesis, of man is created in the image and likeness of God, but is later, very specifically in the New Testament, concretized in Jesus Christ, in the sense that what does it mean to be
in the image and likeness of God. In other words, you set up a question, but in the New Testament, you answer that question. What exactly does it mean to be in the image and likeness of God? And that gives man a chance to come closer to God, to understand what you would do. And what is Christ's message? Statecraft. Turn the other cheek. You know, I mean, read it. Read the Sermon on the Mount. It's one of the most beautiful treatises on statecraft ever written. And the fact of the matter is, Western civilization gets the Italian Renaissance from that development from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's one epic poem.
Now, the Sermon on the Mount, is that prose?
No, absolutely not.
How do you characterize it?
Can you speak up so people can hear, Hugh?
Is the Sermon on the Mount prose?
No, it wasn't written in English, by the way. It was written in ancient Greek.
I've got a problem.
Most people think the Bible was written in English.
The English translation failed. It must be filled.
Huh?
It had to be filled.
What?
The English translation of the Bible has gone through so many different versions.
Yeah, right. But some of it, I think the King James, personally, I think the King James Version most borders on the prosody.
Well, the King James is probably the most poetic.
Yeah, right. But it was written in ancient Greek. It was not written in English. Yeah, and it was poetry.
Okay, but the essence of it. Let's talk about the essence of it. What is it really in the context of what you call prosaic versus poetic or dramatic language?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Let me answer it in a different way.
Maybe you could restate the question.
The question is, what is it about the Sermon on the Mount that makes it poetry and not prose? Right? What is it about it? Because it doesn't rhyme at the end. It doesn't have all the structures of poetry. Okay.
And conversely, why is it not classified as prose?
And conversely, why is it not classified as prose? But it's the same question. Now most people don't understand where poetry comes from. They think that poetry is a structure of language, has a formal ABA structure or a certain iambic structure or a trochaic structure, is long beats, short beats. In other words, if that's how you taught poetry in school, okay? Now, that's not where it comes from. That is not why poets write poetry. Okay, they don't write it because they like the structure of a language and they get to play with it. That's not why they do it. The poet is attempting to search for truth in a language that does not exist. Right? In other words, we know, which we can rigorously prove, is that there are such discoveries that are qualitatively new and have never been thought before. So how do you communicate a discovery of an idea that has never been thought before? Right? How do you do that? Because clearly that's how civilization has advanced. In other words, the great poets, the great thinkers, the great creators, scientists are mainly poets, but the real ones. Leonardo was the greatest poet who ever lived. He was also one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. So how do you do that? How do you communicate an idea that has never been thought before? Well, the first thing you have to do is destroy the previous idea. What is the Sermon on the Mount? Who turns the other cheek when they get hit? How many of you have done that?
Not too many.
Well, you have, I know, but I'm just saying, not too many. Okay.
Out of fear.
No, what I'm saying is Christ in the Sermon on the Mount and in his parables communicates by attacking the normal view of what it means to be human. And by attacking that in a beautiful way, it forces you to say, what must be the state of mind of totally no fear, and somebody hits you, and you turn the other cheek, and you shame them. You hold the mirror to them of who they are, right? And that's more powerful. That brought down Roman civilization. It wasn't force of arms.
that brought down Rome.
It was Christianity.
It was Christianity. But this, Christ discovered an idea of man, because he was God. Discovered an idea of man and gave it to man by forcing man to confront what he would normally do and forcing to think, maybe that's not what we should do. And enough people did that, enough martyrs did that, such that they brought down Roman civilization. That's poetry. That's poetry. To communicate an idea that does not exist and communicate it effectively through metaphor. Huh?
The Old Testament prophets would be poets.
Yes.
It's true.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely. But he asked about the New Testament, so I answered him. Yeah. Yes, but that's where poetry comes from. You cannot communicate ideas without poetry. You can only communicate existing ideas without poetry. But communicating discoveries, and Lynn uses this idea of Aristophanes and how you create a higher hypothesis, which I'm sure you've had a couple of times. I'm not going to go through.
Okay, any more questions? Tony? Oh, and you next, Dorothy, after Tony.
I just wanted to ask about a question of concept of destiny or fate
Yeah.
in Greek society. What's
Yeah,
that?
sure. That was a killer. And Odysseus escaped his fate. That's where the poets come in. Yes, the whole thing was fated. Achilles, the tragedy of Achilles, by the way, and he knows it in the Iliad. He knows he's never going to see his home again. It's fated. If he battles Troy, he could have left. You know, he has this big fight. He's sitting in his ship, and he has a choice to leave or stay. If he stays, he knows he's going to be killed. And you know the famous thing, he does get killed. So yes, they had this idea of Moira or fate, but Aeschylus used it in a very interesting way. Aeschylus said the gods were fated, that there was a law above Olympus. So normally they say Olympus fates everything, right? But in the hands of Aeschylus, he used fate to tell Zeus, you're going down. That's a poet. That's a poet. Yeah, Helen?
This may not be relevant. It occurs to me, speaking of, you know, the British Empire, we grew up on the British Empire. Shakespeare, King Arthur. I was bitterly disappointed to find out there was no such
person is
that
King Arthur.
was real, you know. But during its most illustrious period, that would be Queen Elizabeth and Victoria. You know, they oversaw the rise of empire.
Yeah, they sure did.
They were symbols or
yes, you're
whatever.
right. You're absolutely right.
I can't think of any other.
No, the British Empire was,
she set up a dynasty that began with England. And
sure.
The Windsors and the
Sure.
Stuarts and the Hohenzollerns and the, the Roman Habsburgs.
She actually knows her British history. That's good. That's good. Yeah, but an empire is the death of. This is, by the way, on the Toynbee question. Toynbee was big on empire.
Oh, really?
The question of Toynbee, what he was really talking about was he wanted to see how they could maintain the British Empire, and he figured what they could do is manipulate religion. That was the essence of Toynbee. If you could control the religions of the empire, you could control the destiny of the empire. So he got into Islamic religions and other religions. And he said that's the way you control people. But empire is the death of creativity. It's the death of thinking. Republics are always the way you rely upon the majority of people to think. And republics are created by poets.
If that's true, getting back to your Willy Loman thing, well, how do you account for the what I'll call for the populace appreciation of that play years after years after years?
He asked, why do people really like the death of a salesman?
That's it.
Yeah. Well, it's
People don't like sailing.
People don't like sailing.
That's not the answer.
Now, you see, what we start from the standpoint is usually what's popular is wrong. All right? In other words, the fact that something is popular is because people have been so beaten down to believe that their image of life or the tragedy of their life is that they're small people who cannot change the course of history. That is the tragedy of Willie Loman. He's small. He's set in a time outside of politics, outside of time. There's no heroes. There's no heroic quality to Willie Loman. And in the existential years after the war, when everybody was looking to duck the big issues, Willie Loman was their symbol. Willie Loman was the ultimate schlemiel. No, because when we talk about heroes, we're talking about statecraft. You see, each human, you, and everyone has a responsibility for their nation. When they take responsibility for their nation, they achieve a heroic stature. The whole point of the classical Greek tragedy was every person in that play was thinking about the fate of their nation and what happened to it. And we have become small after the war. Lynn goes through a reason why everybody ran for the hills after the war, and we almost lost our nation. Now we're taking it back, but we have to be big people, right? And only classical tragedy and only classical art speaks to that quality of being better than your fate. Or as Schiller said, dare to be wise, i.e. know the total.
But where does goodness start? Does it start with a nation or the family?
You can't ask that question. It's both. It's both. You don't make a dichotomy between being a good person in your personal life and I mean, you have that in Washington all the time. These guys BS all the time about who they are. But anyway, yeah.
If Western civilization was based on such noble ideas, then what turned into such a monster?
Venice. That's good. Venice. I could give you chapter and verse on that. I know exactly how it happened.
The political gangs of Venice?
Yeah, Venice. There was a war after the Renaissance in which Venice had to be crushed. They were the empires, the oligarchs, and they came within an ace of being crushed. It's a very, very significant story. And Western civilization has had to live with oligarchism and coexist with oligarchism because Venice was never crushed in the League of Cambrai. And if Venice had been crushed at that moment, then nation states based upon this idea of the nobility of man and the qualities of creativity that we've been talking about would have been the basis for nations. We've got to crush Venice. If you don't crush evil, it comes back again. And that's what happened to Western civilization. It wasn't by accident. Because we never crushed the evil of Venice that we got financier capitalism or oligarchism. That the old landed nobility got crushed because they couldn't physically fight against nation states. So what Sarpi, this guy Paolo Sarpi, I did the research on Paolo Sarpi, had decided is what they were going to do is get on the inside and pit one against the other, pit weakness against weakness. And therefore, Sarpi inserted Venice in the process of this nation state and never fought openly. The landed oligarchs fought the nation state openly and tried to crush it militarily. And as Machiavelli pointed out, you cannot crush nation states militarily. A nation state based upon each individual as being noble is a highly effective military force and cannot be crushed by hiring mercenaries to crush it, which they learned. Sarpi was smart enough to realize, well, okay, we're going to have to do it differently, and we're going to bore from within, and we're going to destroy the fruits of Western civilization by destroying first the scientists with this method of empiricism. And if they can knock out the scientists, then the generative force is weakened.
Well, what family in Venice was the main leading villain?
Contarini.
I thought it was the Medici.
No, Medici.
Medici was Florence.
Different story. That was a tricky case. They were Florence anyway. But it's a tricky case. No, it's the Contarinis, the Morosinis, there's a whole book on it. We'll get it to you. But that's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this question of Dionysian dance, because it seems to me this is important, because it seems to me that the purpose of this is to create assassins, it's a cult of assassins.
Yeah.
And that every place
Drugs.
we see it revived in history, it's been at the center of some international terrorist or
Sure.
assassins. Like Mike Medicino has this article on the Frankfurt School,
Yeah.
where he describes Ascona, this commune in Switzerland, which is where every international terrorist related.
And by the way, Martha Graham came out of that.
Yeah.
This was Dionysian dance. It's
Yeah.
literally Dionysian dance.
And it comes up again in Huxley and Brave New World.
Sure. There's always, along with Dionysian dance, there was always drugs and rock music. Drugs and rock. And that's where, you see, the state of mind of a Dionysian is one of pure hedonism. You lose any sense of individuality and any sense of identity. And therefore you can create an assassin that way. And they always have, out of this cult of drug, rock. So that's, yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
On the subject of the poetic form in these writings,
Yeah.
some people brought up the New and the Old Testament, and just from a historical point of view, I know that Lynn fielded a question that was very into this whole idea, and
Yeah.
he said that he doesn't follow the Old Testament because of something like the Babylonian Talmud.
there was a-
I don't understand why you mentioned the King James version. Does that come from the Egyptian Talmud? Could you explain that?
I just
I have
personally
no
like
idea.
it.
I see. That was totally
More
unclear to me.
polite,
What
yes.
I understood the point of his answer,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
then
What he
his
meant
answer
was
also.
that parts of the Old Testament, they had taken all the Jewish priests into Babylon, and they rewrote parts of the Old Testament under it was called the Babylonian captivity.
Right.
And therefore it's suspect because a lot of the stories were rewritten to reflect Babylonian worldview. So it's hard to tell which is which. So you just have to be careful.
I see.
That's really all he was saying.
Okay.
And the King James Version is interesting because I find the language the most rich, most capable of conveying.
Yeah,
some
that's
of the
true.
Okay.
The way that the translation of the Bible
Yeah.
in English language that's totally losing on.
Yeah, right.
And
We'll
and
take
things
one more.
To the
Yeah.
death of a salesman, Willie Loman, and so forth, in light of the discussion.
One saw the reality. There was nothing to do, right? No, it's true. I can give you these pages of this thing, right? So that, and by the way, this is Hollywood. This is the essence of Hollywood. So what Nietzsche goes one step further, and Schopenhauer was his mentor, is that since there is nothing, then the only thing real is what the artist creates. That the artist creates reality. That in facing nothingness, the drive to create is what makes nothingness more than nothingness. Right? Okay, the triumph of the will, right? Which is the essence, he says, of the tragic spirit. Right? So that he goes at that. He also goes further to say that what drives the tragic spirit, what creates the classical drama, is it comes out of what they call the Dionysian dance. That faced with the nothingness of reality, that people decided to just feel, because they knew their feelings. By the way, Descartes is a Dionysiac freak, right? Because he says what is real is our perceptions. The only thing we actually know are our feelings and our perceptions and our knowledge. We know nothing about reality, right? And therefore, dance, an orgiastic dance, in which you lose yourself completely. This is the same famous St. Vitus's dance of the Middle Ages and the other thing, was the the driver force for the creation of the tragedy. Now, it's interesting, because he's not the reason you have, it's interesting to look at Nietzsche. He's not the stupidest guy who ever walked the face of the earth. He's one of the most evil guys who ever walked the face, but not stupid. Because the fact of the matter is, when people descend to the level of beasts, this is what they think. Okay? So he says this, and he said that if you look at the history of Greek classical tragedy, what it starts with is indeed, it is true that the first classical tragedies were the choruses, were Bacchic choruses or Dionysian choruses. In other words, it started at the Olympic Games, and you have to realize it was 10,000 people. Architecture, very, very structured. You know, one was very structured, one was completely unstructured. You know, wild, orgiastic dancing was Dionysus, and Apollo was the one who created an architecture. But he said that fundamentally the drive for tragedy came from Dionysus, right? That the actual drive for tragedy is that tragedy was based upon a certain conception of reality. What was that conception? He develops it in Greek society from what's called the myth of Silenius. Silenius was supposed to be the philosopher who trained Dionysius. Okay. Now Silenius, King Midas, you know, you've heard the Midas touches kind. King Midas, the story goes, wanted to find out the secrets of the universe. And what he did was he set out to find Silenius and beat it out of him. Okay. So they got Silenius, and Silenius says, you don't want to know what the secrets of the universe are. Midas says, no, I do want to know. And Silenius cackles and he says, man, race of man, it were better you were never born. That's first best. But if you are born, it is better to die soon. Okay. Now this myth of Silenius, Nietzsche says, was the basis of classical tragedy, or Greek tragedy. That this idea that in truth, there was nothing that was real. There was nothing fundamental to the universe. And therefore, if mankind truly faced reality, he would say to himself, there is nothing, but I'm here. It's a precursor, it's existentialism. There is nothing, I'm here, and therefore my existence itself is an absurdity with respect to the universe. All right, which is the silent, and what Nietzsche says is that in facing that, quote, reality, that is where tragedy came from. That indeed, and in fact, there's a great defense of Hamlet in Nietzsche's work, in The Birth of Tragedy. He defends Hamlet. He said Hamlet, that to write real history always borders on the attempt to write classical drama. Always. All good histories must have certain principles of classical drama. Schiller, in writing the history of the Netherlands, has, if you read this, classical drama. One of the reasons that Schiller became a dramatist, and Shakespeare, and I'll prove tonight Aeschylus and others, is that they were first and foremost historians. They were first and foremost trying to figure out why things were the way they were and how you could change them, right? So, for instance, Schiller chose, it wasn't arbitrary, the plays that Schiller chose. Like, for instance, for France, the Punctum Saliens for France was what Joan of Arc did. There would be no nation of France but for what Joan of Arc did, okay, in terms of militarily saving the place, and that laid the basis for later Louis XI, who was trained by the Brethren of the Common Life, to create France. But he chose the Punctum Saliens for the creation of France. Also in England, what play did he write for England? Maria Stuart, or the battle between Queen Elizabeth and Mary Stuart. A moment of critical importance for what shaped England. So he was always, as a historian, he first did tremendous studies of the particular period that he was doing, and then tried to focus in on the key moment and provide the psychological insight on why things were the way they were. All right? So this idea that drama is something entertaining, in the sense that most people think of Hollywood drama, it is exactly not that. It has never been that. It is an attempt to get at certain fundamental truths about how a society and how a civilization is formed. Now, with that said, I want to do something that has probably never been done before. What we're first going to do is we're going to look at one of the most influential writers on the question of classical tragedy, a guy by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote a very famous essay, probably one of the most influential essays, on where it's called The Birth of Tragedy. This was a very early essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, who later was a precursor to fascism. And he was part of a project that was set up by a guy by the name of Richard Wagner in Germany. Wagner wrote these operas, these very strange operas. We used to have a joke. These ring cycles, they're playing the ring cycle. Now, each of the operas is 3 hours, right? But there's 3 of them, so it's a 9-hour opera. And the music is terrible. I guess a guy named Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, once said of Wagner, he's not as bad as he sounds. So the joke was that you know, we went out in front of the Chicago. Therese was with us. We picketed, because this was the precursor to fascism. We picketed the ring cycle, which was being played in Chicago. And I was on a bullhorn. I said, well, you might walk in, but you'll goose step out, right? That's what I was shouting at the top of my lungs. And some wit came up to me afterwards. I almost got killed there, too, but anyway. Some wit came up to me afterwards and said, you got it wrong. Get him on the way out. Then they'll really be angry at Wagner. Which was good advice, but we couldn't wait 9 hours. But anyway, so with that said, Nietzsche was part of this circle around Wagner. And in fact wrote The Birth of Tragedy as a defense of Wagner's lousy German opera, which, by the way, had a cult movement around Wagner, which later became the fascist movement of Germany. What was the core idea that Nietzsche develops on the question of tragedy, birth of tragedy? He first develops 2 categories of mind. The first, he says, is Dionysian, after the god of revelry, or Bacchic revelry, you know, Bacchus, Dionysus, which is the god of dance, he says, right? Which was, I mean, he was the god of dance in Greek mythology. And then there was Apollonian, which was what he said, the Doric.
Tonight.
Let me be a little bit autobiographical on how I got into this question of drama. I didn't, in the beginning, I actually didn't know why I was doing it. But I've attempted, through the course of many years, to write history. You know, I studied the history of the labor movement. I studied the history of, as Therese said, Rosicrucianism. And when you study history, and you're not just going to be an academic or make a living at it, but really try to understand what happened, what really happened, what made people do what they did in that moment of history. It always borders, always, on classical drama. In other words, you're always led to And every period of history, by the way, does have something called a punctum saliens. In other words, when you write history from a real standpoint as opposed to an academic standpoint, what are you attempting to do? You're trying to understand why people did what they did and why we are the way we are today. What are the historical decisions that people made that led us to where we are? That's the only interest in history, unless you're going to be some stupid professor who basically is making a living at it, and that's publish or perish. It doesn't really matter what you say, you know, as a professor. So, but the point is that it always verged on a moment of truth, a moment where a decision by an individual, and that's the only way to study history. This idea of sociological phenomena is just stupid. It's individuals at a key moment in history who can make a difference, either decide to make a difference, which is rarer in history, but it does happen, which is how our country came into being, right, which is one of the studies I made, or where, more likely, individuals try to just refuse to make a fundamental decision, and things devolve from that, right? So that it is always the case, and by the way, I will prove tonight, it has always been the case, that that tragedy comes from an individual attempting to conceive of why things are the way they are, as opposed to have just a sense certainty view that it is what it is, and it happened yesterday, okay?